Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. I enjoy my new career in the media and meeting fascinating people on this podcast. Life's pretty good for me, but sometimes I deeply miss my policing career. I think it's that satisfaction I felt bringing certain people to justice. Some cases just stick with you more than others. It's a feeling any true detective knows well. Well, today's guest knows that feeling. He knows what I'm talking about. He's a former New South Wales police officer. One case that he worked on has been described as one of the most bizarre murder investigations in Australia's criminal history. It's a story of a man who had two wives, who both died in suspicious circumstances, which was either sheer bad luck, a coincidence, or something more sinister. Well, today's guest, retired detective Peter Seymour, gave his all to that case, and it took him 15 years to get answers for a family torn apart by a violent, pathological, jealous husband. Peter will discuss this case in the type of minute detail only a person who has lived and breathed the case can. The case is covered in a book titled Seven Bones, which Peter co-authored. It's a fascinating read. Peter Seymour, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thank you, Gary.
It's been a long time since we've seen each other, and it might have been, careers in the police. We always cross paths, but speaking to you the other day brought back memories of a crime scene we turned up to. I was in homicide and you were the local detectives. That goes way back 2000, was it?
To 2000, that's correct. Around June, July 2000 at St Mary's.
And we both haven't aged a day since then.
That's correct. That's right.
Lucky this is a podcast and they haven't got photos. It's interesting because your career path you spent 4 years in uniform, I believe.
Yeah, I joined the New South Wales Police in 1980.
Yeah.
I went to Blacktown and served a few years there in uniform before going up into the detective's office and doing my training duties up there.
Tell us about your 4 years in uniform at Blacktown, because in the early 80s it would have been pretty rough and ready, I would imagine.
Yeah, look, it was terrific. To get stationed at a busy place like Blacktown when you first join the police is so beneficial. You get your hands dirty in a lot of range of issues. So your grounding at a busy station sets you up for your career, basically, because you get to do everything.
Yeah.
As opposed to going to a station where things are a lot calmer and you're not doing as much. You're not exposed to all the facets of policing.
At a busy station like Blacktown back in the day, you would have been thrown in the deep end. I don't think people realise when they see a police truck pull up, quite often around those times, you might be lucky and get to work with a veteran, but quite often you're, after about a year, you're the senior person on the truck and making the calls.
That's correct, and that's what happened with me. About 18 months in, that's exactly right. You're the senior person on the truck. And here I joined the police as an 18-year-old, straight out of school. I spent a bit of time in a warehouse waiting to be old enough to join. And as an 18, 19-year-old, you go into domestics where you're dealing with adults, perhaps twice your age, and sorting out their marital problems.
It's funny. All the cops I know, but the ones I come and speak to on the podcast talk about that. How ridiculous you feel as a young lady or a young man with no life experience telling a middle-aged married couple how they should live their lives, and it's quite daunting, isn't it?
It is, and it's just one part of the role that we were exposed to back in those days. Other things that people don't realise you get subjected to is perhaps delivering a death message. So as a 19-year-old junior officer, but being the senior person on a crew, to, in the early hours of the morning, rock up at a house to give the devastating news to a family that one of their children perhaps has died in a car accident somewhere.
Talk to us about that. How did you feel? How did you prepare yourself for that? Have you got one that you could reference without sort of naming names? Or
Yeah, look, I had to do a few, unfortunately. And I never forget the first one. It was a young man had died in a car accident out in the country. It was probably around 1 o'clock in the morning. It's hard because it's very hard to prepare yourself for something like that. You just never know what you're going to be able to say to people. All you can do is go there. I knocked on the door. I had a junior constable with me. The father came to the door, and I introduced myself, gave him a name, and from Blacktown Police Station. I said, "Are you Mr.?" I can't even remember his name now. He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you mind if we come in?" And you can tell by the look on their faces.
From that moment, that's not going to be
know
good news.
It's not good news. And especially when the next step, when we go inside, say is, "Have you got a son by the name of this?"
Yeah.
They know. By that stage, I vividly remember his wife had come out in a dressing gown, and they just sat down and they just looked at me. And it felt like forever. And then I had to give the news that, unfortunately, their son had been involved in a car accident and had passed away in hospital, and the location of where he was. And you can only just sit there and watch as they break down and offer condolences and just say, "Look, if there's anything we can do to help you, I'll give you all the information you need." But it's very difficult to look at a family that is suddenly torn apart by the news that you've just had to give them.
It doesn't leave you, does it? And when you're talking like that, it's making me reflect on my first one. And as a senior person, I was a probationary constable in very similar circumstances like that, knocking on the door. Can we come in? And the moment you've said that, then, are you such and such? Do you want to sit down? And then you drop that news. And you just feel so inadequate, don't you?
Oh, you do. And people say, "Look, well, police, you're given training to deal with
You're not given
all these sorts of situations, but there's no amount of training in the world that can help you deal with something like that adequately, in my view anyway."
I agree 100%. And you become conditioned to it, but it never, if you've got an ounce of empathy or human emotion in you, it's something that you'd never enjoy doing. And you watch the people, their life just crumbles in front of your eyes, and you literally, like the physical collapse, we see that where they collapse on the ground.
Yes.
And where do you take it from there? But that's, that is part of policing. And in somewhere like Blacktown in the 80s, every day would have been an adventure. You wouldn't have known what you were going to walk into.
Oh, that's right. From the moment you walked into the station, took over from the shift that had just finished, you just never knew what was going to happen, and that was the thrill of it, really. As a young cop, that's what you enjoyed.
Yeah.
Not knowing what you were going to walk into, but back in those days, we all were mates, and I always felt comfortable that no matter what happened, I had good police around me.
The people that will got your back. And it's funny the bond you form, because I think you're all thrown in at that deep end, and life is an adventure, and you get those beeps that come over the radio, and all of a sudden you got your blue lights on and you're heading to something and you have no idea what you're walking into.
Exactly right.
Some people might say that's a horrible way to spend your working day, but it was certainly interesting and character forming.
Oh, totally. It was. Look, I enjoyed my career in the police, and as I said, as a young guy, it was exciting. As you get older and more experienced, that excitement, I suppose, drops a little bit. You're more cautious because you sort of know
what can go wrong.
That's right.
Yeah. And your career, we'll talk on your career, work your way through the career where you're a detective and also prosecuting. But I look back at my career, and I'm proud of my career, as I'm sure you're proud of your career. But I have total admiration to the guys and ladies that spend their whole career in uniform, because they're the real frontline police, aren't they?
Oh, they are. They're the ones that are first on the scene, generally all the time. And as detectives, we rely upon them to preserve scenes, to make all their notes, to be able to tell us exactly what they saw when they first arrived and took control of things. So, yeah, they're, as you said, they're the front line.
And they literally walk into everything, walk into anything, I should say. They have no idea when they're responding to a call what they're going to be confronted with. You spent 4 years in general duties. What was it that attracted you to become a detective?
I'd always wanted to be a detective from the moment I joined the police. That was my career ambition.
Yep.
So it was actually probably around 3 years I was in general duties at Blacktown, and then I got to know the local detectives there, the boss and everyone quite well. They took over some jobs that I'd first responded to, and we had a good relationship with all the detectives there, and it was a natural progression for me. So they helped me along. I ended up going up to Blacktown and did my A-list duties there, my initial duties. And back then, we would get transferred to a different station to continue on your training duties. So from Blacktown, after it was probably around a year, I ended up getting transferred down to Newtown Detective's office.
Right. And that was a bit daunting. Well, I'd talk from my experience. I'm assuming you would have been a little bit daunted by it as well, because the detectives, and back in those days, you joined 80, I joined 85, but it was like a scene off a TV show in the detective's office. There was people were smoking in the office. The detectives were walking around with their shoulder holsters, and they were gruff and they were arrogant and had a bit of a swagger about them. Is that the type of thing that you walked into?
Oh, exactly right. I had my first cup of coffee in the detective's office at Blacktown. Never drunk coffee before, but it was the norm. So you just followed suit and... away you go. And
the sitting around at lunchtime playing cards around the smoke-filled room, and this is those TV detectives they exist. But
yes.
What were one of the first jobs you got as a detective where you took it from the start to the finish? Because I think that's what attracted me to being a detective. And you mentioned that you went to some cases that you handed over to detectives. What I really enjoyed about plain clothes, that you could often pick up a job from start to finish. Do you recall a particular job?
At Blacktown, not so much, as it was more learning off the other senior guys, and there were some great detectives back then. One in particular who took me under his wing was Kevin Rowie.
Yeah, has a good reputation.
Oh, yeah. Terrific detective, and the best thing about working with Kevin on the night shift, what we called the wireless car back then, was the first, unless something came up straight away that we walked into, the first 3/4 of an hour to an hour, Kevin would take me over various situations. We might discuss murders, we might discuss armed robberies, and he'd give me basically a lesson. And go over the proofs we need, all that sort of stuff. So it was terrific to spend time with people like Kevin when I first went into the detective's office.
I think it can define your career, who your mentors are, and the people that you follow, and there's virtually a lineage that's passed through. And we're referencing where I turned up at that homicide scene that you were running as a local detective, and I turned up with Paul Jacob.
Yes.
And he was my mentor, and I was so fortunate to work under him, and the type of things, it was invaluable, the skill set that he passed on. And,
that's right.
I was like a sponge. And throughout, and you speak to a lot of people, everyone pays homage to someone that taught them, because you can learn, you go through the academy, you go through the detectives course and you do all that, but where you really learn it is at the coalface.
Exactly right. And as I said, I was very fortunate with the detectives that I worked with when I was first starting off. People like Evan, and the boss there was Pat Toohey.
Yep.
People like that, their experience is invaluable.
Yeah. I'd see them and they'd look, sometimes I'm not referencing the people you're talking about, but the old detective sergeant, they'd be sitting in an office and they look like half asleep, or they might be reading the paper or whatever, but you could go in there and get advice. You've got a complicated job. You could walk in and with a couple of minutes they've processed all the information and said, okay, this is what you got to do. And
that's right.
That type of stuff. A lot of people were turned away by from working in detectives, I think, fear of going to court? Because that's something that if you go in the plain clothes and detective, you're going to spend a lot of time in the witness box, and it's fairly daunting experience for all of us being cross-examined in the witness box. How did you find court in your early times in plain clothes?
I actually didn't mind it. You always got very nervous before going in because, you're going into an environment where you don't know what to expect. You don't know what questions you're going to be asked. We're always told, look, just keep your answers as short and simple as possible. Don't overcomplicate things. So you're always nervous. And if anyone says they're not nervous before they go into witness box,
they're going to stuff up.
Yeah. Or they're just lying.
Yeah.
But I actually enjoyed it because, to me, when you go in the witness box, you're there to tell the truth.
Yep.
You're simply there to say what you saw, what you heard, what you did, and keep it simple, and that's your job. So as nervous as you get, if you stick to those principles, you're always fine.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. It's funny, you go into some cases and you think, we've got the strongest case. There's you're not worried about it at all. And you walk out after a not guilty verdict and you think, what happened there? And then other cases you think, we're a little bit thin, and you get the guilty verdict and you walk out and think,
you can't pick it, can you?
You can't.
And also in the preparation, you say that you get nervous. And when I used to lecture on detectives courses, I'd say it's important to get nervous before the court because that will make you prepare for it and learn your evidence and get your head around the brief. But time and again, I'd be thinking, I've covered off on everything. I can't see any holes in what we've got. And you'd be in the witness box in the first 5 minutes, some smart-ass barrister has asked you a question, and you sit there and try and look calm and you think, that's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. So it was a challenge, but it was rewarding. And when you got out of the witness box and you held your own and you're matching the intellect and the wits of barristers that are trying to humiliate you, whether it's in front of a magistrate or a jury, it's important to have that confidence, and you do feel like you're earning your stripes when you get out of the witness box and you've held your ground and made sure the truth comes out.
That's exactly right. It's a really good feeling when you know that a barrister or solicitor's thrown everything at you that they can to try and trip you up.
Yeah.
And it hasn't worked, and you've, as you say, held your own.
Yeah. There was another thing early on in your career, or relatively early on in your career, when we were talking the other day that is a concern, but it's a personal situation that you had a person that was stalking your wife. Yeah,
it was when we were early on in our marriage.
And this is when you were a police officer?
That's right. I was at Penrith Detectives at the time. And I had to do a lot of landscaping in my backyard, and we got a guy in from the local papers who was selling bushrock. He had a lease up Singleton Way, I believe. For some unknown reason, he decided he would start stalking my wife and ringing her and saying he was going to rape her, and I won't go into the things that he said he'd do to her and that, but... she'd blow whistles, loud whistles
when
into the phone and that. And it came out eventually that what he was doing was ringing the police station and just saying, "Oh, it's Detective Seymour there. Oh, no, he's on 3 o'clock this afternoon. You'll catch him then." Oh, okay. And then, so sure enough, 4 or 5 o'clock, she'd start getting the phone calls.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, during that process, she got that stressed out. She had a miscarriage. It was our first pregnancy, and she lost that. But eventually we tracked him down through phone traces. He was ringing up from his girlfriend's house. Anyway, we tracked him down, got him in. Obviously, I was allowed by the boss to do the investigation up to a certain point, but not allowed to, once we identified what was going on.
Yeah, that's probably a good call.
Definitely. Yeah. And I knew that would be the case anyway. I had to hand it over and let other detectives do the arrest and interviewing and charging. And
do you think that happened because you were a police officer? What was it? Because stalking offences concern me, and I spent the majority of my career as a homicide detective, but I always got concerns whether I was, investigating minor crimes or whatever, a stalker. It is a really creepy crime. The fact that he knew you were a police officer, was that part of the thrill for him? Could you work out what was going on in his deluded mind?
No, we never found that out. Basically, we believe he just took a shine to my wife because she, at one stage, on one of the delivery drop-offs, it was a hot day, and my wife was just bringing him out, and he had a brother with him, bringing out drinks for them, and looking after them, and it all started after that. Whether it was a bit of a thrill for him thinking that he was doing it to a cop's wife, I don't know. We never got to the bottom of that, but he ended up being charged with 2 counts under the Telecommunications Act for making these calls via the phone, and he was sentenced to 6 months jail.
Oh, and well, that's good. That because it's one offence that, and I've seen it throughout my career, that always concerns me when they're stalking like that. They're getting a thrill from it, and it potentially escalates. Now, one of the things at the start that I talked about a murder investigation that really impacted on you. And it's one that you co-authored the book, 7 Bones, and I've had a look at the book and read the book, and it's a great read, and it really gives you an insight into a detective on a case, like a dog with a bone, basically described. No reference to the fact that 7 bones. That's probably the wrong choice of words, but. At the start of the book, there's something that I just want to read out. Then we're going to get you to talk about this particular case and the impact it had, obviously, on the victims and the tragedy of what befell the victims, but also step by step how you unravelled the circumstances of these ladies' deaths. So, the first lady was Jean Angela Kear. And this is in your book. The first time I heard her name was when I was handed a missing persons file back in 1989. I had no idea that from that moment that brief was put in my hand, my life and that of my family would be completely and utterly turned upside down. It sounds like the start of a crime novel, which it is. It sounds like the start of a movie. Tell us about it. What happened?
Well, you go to all different crime scenes, as we've already spoken about, and you don't know what to expect. But to go to a scene that would play out for 15 or 16 years and take up so much of your time, personal time, your work time, have such an effect on your family, because you come home and, Gary, you've probably experienced this, all you've got in your mind is what's going on in the investigation.
Yeah, it's hard to let it go.
It is. And sometimes you come home, you just want to be with yourself. You know, I had young kids that want your time, and I'd find at times I'd just say, look, just leave me alone.
Yeah.
You know, and then I'd feel sorry about it.
It's wrong, but you're at that point where you've got nothing left to give of yourself. You've given everything to what you're investigating. I know the feeling.
Yeah, that's right. And then, you know, then the guilt would come into it, and you feel sorry, and I'd go and apologise to the kids or my wife. And my wife was brilliant. She knew when I walked in the door, she could tell, just leave him alone, he needs time to himself. Yeah. Or we'll have a chat and whatever. But it consumed my life and my family's life, I guess, for 15 to 16 years.
Okay. So the starting point was this missing persons file that you received. Talk us through that. Yeah,
it was, look, a routine job. She'd been reported missing, Jean Keir. Missing persons had the matter, and they just sent out a file to do some follow-up. Check with the family, check with the husband, anyone that you could contact, friends and that, just to see if there was any further fresh information as to whether someone had heard from her, had any contact, and then put all the information down, back on the form, send it back to missing persons.
Describe the type of person Jean was so we can get an understanding of what we're dealing with here.
Okay, Look, and I never met her, obviously, but talking to her parents, talking to her siblings and her friends, she was just a vibrant, very attractive young lady, full of life, just loved the friends, loved going out. And
how old was she?
She was in her late teens.
Yep.
She'd actually met her husband Tom through her mother.
Right.
She'd go down. Mum worked with Tom in the upholstery business, and that's how they met. And he sort of chased her from there. But she was in her late teens around that time, early 20s. But just a very bubbly, vivacious, full of life young lady.
So that relationship, prior to her disappearance, Tom and Jean married?
They married. They had one little boy, and it was not long after they got married, according to family and friends from our investigation, that things started to unravel and his domineering ways and controlling ways took over. She wasn't allowed to go out with her friends unless he approved of it. He'd make sure that people came to their place. So he started controlling everything that she did. If they went out, say, to the beach or somewhere or out on the water, and she wore something that he believed was too revealing, like a bikini, he would make her put other clothes on. And he even went to the extent of altering her clothes if he thought that they were too revealing.
It's pretty extreme, isn't it? Very controlling.
Very controlling.
Yeah.
And there's one other disturbing point that came up when talking to his friends is he came home one day. They'd only just had the little boy. Jean was in the bath with him, and she just had the baby. He was only a newborn and had him resting on her chest. And by all reports, Tom lost it and said that was not appropriate and made her get out of the bath. And she was never to do that again.
So when you got that missing persons report, what were the circumstances? Who reported her, and what was the circumstances of her disappearance? Well,
they'd gone down. The marriage was on the rocks. Jean wanted to go and spend a week away with her sister and her sister's boyfriend down at Culburra. They had a caravan down there in the caravan park. Tom eventually agreed to let her go there, but not take their son.
Yep.
He was to remain with Tom. My personal view on that was it was his guarantee that she'd come back.
Yeah.
Because she'd never leave her son. And that was something that everyone said. Her son was her life. So she wouldn't go anywhere without him.
Yep.
So she went down there. Tom went down there a couple of days early and dragged her back into the car to take her home. Said, "You've been away long enough."
Oh, so he agreed to let her go away with her friends, but it was for 5 days, and after 2 or 3 days, he's turned up and said, "You're coming back."
You're coming back. Chased her around the car, they had an argument. Her sister said to her boyfriend, who was a fair lump of a guy himself, "You need to do something." And I'll never forget this fellow giving his evidence in the trials. But he on that point, he said, if I'd have stepped in at that point and stopped him, she'd probably still be alive today. And he has wrestled with that thought and the guilt that he felt by not intervening and letting Kear sort of manhandle Jean, throw her into the car and drive off. And that was the last she was seen alive.
I could imagine someone carrying that guilt. So that's who reported her missing then?
Her family reported her missing, her parents. Tom didn't report her missing initially, but eventually...
And how long are we talking about?
Look, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was a few days after she disappeared.
Yep.
And eventually Tom came in to do it as well, to report her, because I think the family put the pressure on him. So, something needs to be done. But part of Tom's story was that he had phone calls from Jean since she left, because we found out Jean had a one-night affair.
Yep.
With a guy. Tom tracked him down, and he actually was the last independent person to see Jean alive, because when they were coming back from the caravan park, Jean got away from him at a service station and made her way down to Bondi to this man's apartment. Tom got home after a few hours, thought this is probably where she's gone. He made contact with him and said, yeah. He said, yeah, she's here. Tom said, bring her home. So this guy said, look, I'm not getting involved anymore in your marital affairs, so, yeah, I'm going to take you home, even though Jean tried to tell him not to. But he dropped her home, and his evidence is that he saw her walk through the front door past Kear, who was standing at the front door, and inside the house, and that was the last he saw of her.
Okay, so that, in effect, that's the last, outside of her husband, who she was in conflict with, that's the last reported sighting of her?
Yes.
And so what happened with the investigation from that point in time, from the missing persons? You've done your checks. What happened?
Yeah, well, it took a long while to get hold of Keir at his house.
Yeah.
I went round to his place a number of times, at all different times of the day and evening, and he was never there. And it was just one afternoon shift, around 9, 10 o'clock. I saw a light on in the house. So we knocked on the door, and he was there. And it was just strange. I just had this feeling when I was talking to him, there's something not right here. It was nothing in particular. There was just something about him. I just didn't feel right. But he said that she'd taken off. She had an affair. She'd taken off, and he didn't know where she was.
So that was his statement to police, that she's just basically run off with this other bloke?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so look, I chased up with the parents and friends, and no one had heard from her.
Yeah.
So I put all the information on the missing person file, was sent back, and it wasn't till a couple of years later that I was called in early on a Saturday to the same house where a woman's body was found inside the house that had been set on fire. And when the penny dropped on the address, because as I said, it's a couple of years later, I went there thinking, and Thomas Keir was there at the time, the detectives were already on site, thinking, that's his wife, so she's obviously come back. And when I mentioned
thinking that was Jean.
That was Jean.
So this is just so we're clear on it, that you've got Jean was reported missing in 88 or 89,
89.
I think, but last seen in 88 or whatever.
Yep.
Then 3 years later, you're being called into work on call or whatever, and there's a situation at the same house where Jean disappeared from.
That's right.
And what was tell us the situation there?
Well, when I've got to the scene, putting everything together, and I said to the detective that was on site at the time, Mick Lyons, I said, so that's his wife, Jean. And Mick looked at me and said... Because
there was a deceased there.
Yeah, deceased female.
Yeah.
Inside the house, on the bed, had a bed lamp cord wrapped around her neck, and both hands were up under her
defensive.
Defensive, as if trying to get the cord from the neck. And she was burnt beyond recognition. From the initial investigations at the scene, it was believed that it was Tom Keir's wife.
And you naturally assumed it was Jean.
That it was Jean.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I was told, well, no, he's remarried. Her name's Rosalina. And after speaking to the detectives on the site, and knowing that Tom Keir was going to be arrested for it because he was the last person seen leaving the house by all the neighbours. No one else was seen entering the house. They had a German Shepherd dog that would bark at everything.
Break down the timings of that. So what, to arrest someone for murder, you've got to be confident that you've got information. What were the circumstances? So it was the middle of the day, was it?
It was in the morning.
Yep.
They lived on a corner in a corner house. So the next door neighbour in the cul-de-sac was out the front doing paving in his driveway.
Yep.
So he saw everyone coming and going from the front of the house. He gave evidence that he saw Tom come or leave the house with the son, drive up the road, come back, left his van across the road with the little boy in it, go back into the house. He was in there for 5 or 10 minutes, then leave. No one else came in through the front of the house, through the front of the property.
Yep.
And within 10 minutes of Tom driving off, there was smoke and flames coming out from the front main bedroom window. He raced across, grabbed the hose and
This is the neighbour.
the neighbour trying to hose it, but it was too intense by that stage, and he had to back off and call emergency services. We had a neighbour around the other side, in the other street, out waiting for the real estate to turn up. They also saw Keir come and go because his van was parked across the road in their site. No one else was seen entering the property from the rear.
Yeah.
And as I said, they had a German Shepherd. Keir had a German Shepherd dog that would bark often if there was someone around. Didn't make a noise. There were other neighbours who came back and lived across the road who saw the van there and then it was gone and didn't hear or see anything else. So there was nothing from the dog, no screams from Rosalina, and she was identified ultimately. And the only person seen coming and going from the place was Tom. And the place was on fire within 10 minutes of him leaving.
Do you know if she, because the forensic post-mortem, did it determine whether she died through strangulation or died from the fire?
Yeah, she was strangled and burnt beyond recognition.
Right.
Basically, she was just a charred body laying on the bed.
And deliberately lit arson?
Yes. Yeah, there was accelerants found all through the bedroom and down the hallway. And that's the other thing. They had a detached garage at the rear of the property. So for someone to set fire to the place, they had to go outside into the garage, grab the accelerant, come back.
Know where it is.
Yeah, spread it around and then set fire to the place, put the accelerant back and then go.
Okay. Well, this is just the start of this amazing story, and I'll put it on record now just to protect us that it was Tom that was charged with the murder.
Yes.
But at trial he was acquitted. So for all intents and purposes, and we'll put it on record here that Tom, her husband, who was charged with the murder, was acquitted of the murder. So we can't take it any further than that. So you're just relaying the information that you've got that was presented when you've turned up there.
That's correct. Yeah, the jury found him not guilty. So as far as the law is concerned, Tom was not guilty of that offence.
Okay. Well, we can still talk the lead up. It's public record that at the information that you had, there was sufficient evidence for him to be charged. At what stage was he charged?
He was charged that evening.
Okay.
He was interviewed, taken back to Mount Druitt Police Station, interviewed and charged later that night.
And when was he participated in an interview?
He did, yes. He stated that he wasn't there.
Right.
Simple as that. He when he left the house for the last time, he drove straight to the local Westfield Mount Druitt shopping centre, which is roughly around 4 or 5 minutes away, went straight into a shop, bought a bottle of scotch because he said he had a sore throat, and he took a swig of the scotch to gargle for the sore throat. He'd also bought a cigarette lighter just prior to that. But his alibi was he wasn't there. He was at the shopping centre and he produced dockets to show what time he'd bought these items.
And he had his son with him?
Had his son with him.
How old was the son at that stage?
3, I believe.
Okay. We'll put that aside, just that part of the investigation. We'll come back to that. But now that you've got a situation where you've turned up where this person has, his wife, whether he's involved or not involved, has died in suspicious circumstances, or let's take it further, if you've got the cord round your throat and there's arson, she's been murdered.
That's right.
Been murdered. Then you've got 3 years before, this person has claimed that his wife had just disappeared, never to be seen again.
That's correct.
So from a detective's point of view, what were you thinking?
Well, straight away I thought, hang on, we've got a dead second wife. First wife's missing, and as you said, never to be heard of again. And according to the family at the time, run away and left her son, which, as I said, was her world. It just didn't add up. So I said to the other detectives who were looking after Rosalina's matter, you concentrate on that. I'm going to start looking into Jean's disappearance further.
Okay, so you're running two sort of separate investigations, but there's an obvious overlap.
That's right.
Tell me, and this is something that I think came out in the book, that the first wife and the second wife had an association too.
Yeah, they were distant relatives.
Yeah.
And people have asked me about how could he remarry after a couple of years. But what he did, he got introduced to Rosalina by the family at a wedding, I believe, a family function.
So Jean's family, the first wife's family, introduced him to Rosalina.
That's right.
Who became his second wife.
Yeah, and look, I kept in touch, close contact with Jean's mum and husband, mum and dad, and the family. We built up a good relationship. And in talking to Jean's mum, Christine, who's since passed, she said in a really strange way, she thought if Tom had another female interest, if Jean was alive, and she didn't really think that she was at that stage, but if she was, on the off chance, that this may flush her out.
That doesn't surprise me, Peter. That's the sadness of when people just disappear and the families don't have answers. And like that, you could say strange, almost desperate way of, okay, we might get to the truth this way if he forms another relationship. But it just sort of speaks to the pain that families of missing people find every day. They're always wondering,
exactly,
are they still alive? Are they going to walk through the door at some stage?
That's right. And so Tom followed Rosalina over to the Philippines and married her over there,
right,
and then brought her back to Australia.
Okay, what was how bail refused when Tom was charged?
Yes,
with the murder.
Yes,
and how did you go about building a case for the first wife, for Jean?
Well, the first thing we really need to do was to find out what was going on in the relationship.
Yep.
Find out if there was any MO, any reason for her to disappear, either of her own accord, because it was an open investigation, or whether there was foul play. So we went straight to the family, found out all her school friends, all the friends that she'd kept in touch with, and to get an idea of what she was like prior to being married to Tom, and how did she appear after being married to Tom, and did she say anything? Why was the marriage in trouble? And all these sorts of things. And we started building up a bit of a profile of a girl who went from this real bubbly, beautiful looking, vivacious, full of life, to a girl who became very withdrawn. Friends said that she'd, on a hot day, be wearing long sleeves, and they found that she was covering up bruises. She'd wear sunglasses, and she'd have bruised eyes, and she'd make up all these excuses.
So the classic signs of being in a violent domestic relationship.
That's correct. Yeah. Wouldn't associate with her friends very much at all now. So there was the pattern of her physical and mental demise, which led to her finding a way into Sydney one day and just crying. And that's when this other gentleman came across her and thought, what's wrong here? And befriended her, and she had the one-night stand with him. So you could see the pattern of how her life was spiralling since she got married. And
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, domestic violence is not just physical violence, but the controlling nature, mentally, it takes it out on people.
I think we've got a greater understanding of it in this day and age, but you wind it back to back then, everyone looks at it and thinks and suspects and that, but no one was speaking up against it or about it. And it's a terrible thing, and we see it time and time again with victims of domestic violence. It starts off as physical intimidation, and then it ends up where homicide are actually a call.
That's correct.
So you're working on this case. Where are you attached at this stage? You're at
Mount Druitt.
Mount Druitt. Homicide weren't running it at that stage?
No. As I said, Tom had already been charged with Rosalina's murder, so that court process was taking place. And off to the side, I was looking into Jean's disappearance, getting whatever information we could from the family and friends. And then during Tom's court process on Rosalina's matter, he was eventually granted bail at the coroner's court, but for a period of time he spent some weeks in Long Bay while he was trying to raise that bail. What he did, unfortunately for him, was he spoke to a cellmate, a prison inmate there, and told him what he'd done, that he'd murdered his first wife too.
Right.
That inmate told another inmate who had an upcoming bail application in the Supreme Court. He was charged with a rape matter. So he approached Keir and with the information that he had from the other prison inmate, put the bounce on Keir and said, I know what you did. And Keir said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And eventually he said, well, this is what you've done. This is what I know you've done. And his information to us eventually was that the drink that Tom was holding in a cup, his hand shook that much that he started spilling it.
Yeah.
And the guy said, I know what you've done. So he contacted the police involved in his matter and said, I want to talk to the detectives in this guy's matter.
Case.
I've got some information for them. And he wouldn't talk to anyone else.
Right.
So that morning I came in, I was given the information. I made arrangements with Long Bay to have the prisoner brought up to a private room.
Yep.
And went down there, spoke to him. And there were things that he told me that he could not possibly have known. They weren't made public. For example, Keir, when being interviewed about Jean, told us that after a few months, Jean rang him. And he'd spoken to her a couple of times, that she was still alive, she'd taken off, and she was okay. And no one knew about that except us investigators. It wasn't made public. So for this guy to know that sort of information, I thought, well, he's got to have got that from Keir.
So that's an important point when you're dealing with prison informants, and they do present themselves, and exactly the way you described it happens time and again, because information is a trading card for people in prison, but their credibility starts at ground zero.
Exactly.
You're not going to trust them to start with, and it's interesting that you made the assessment, because that's how I always looked at prison informants. Well, what information have they actually got that they couldn't have readily, that is not public? Because I've spoken to prison informants who go blah blah blah, and I think, yeah, you read yesterday's newspaper. Thanks very much. See you later.
Exactly right.
Go back to your cell. But then others have that snippet of information that, this has got a ring of truth about it. So is that the feeling that you had when you were dealing with these informants?
Exactly right. It was those bits of information that he could not have known, that he had to have got from Keir, that made his information credible.
Right.
And when I was first talking to him in this room, and he wanted to make a deal. The very first thing he said, I want to do a deal. I've got a Supreme Court bail application coming up. And I said, well, you tell me what you know. You tell me the information. I'll assess whether it's credible or not, and then we'll discuss what we can do to assist you in your bail application. But until you tell me what you know, there's no deal. There's nothing I'm going to do for you. And I actually got up and went to walk out, and he called me back. Good
play. You've got to set the rules straight away.
Exactly right.
Yep.
I thought, I'm not here to muck around. Either you're going to tell me what you know, or I'm walking.
Yeah.
And I said I got up, started walking, and he called me back and started going through it. And he said, look, I'm not going to sign anything. I said, that's fine. Just tell me what you know, and I'll write it all down. I'll get you to read it and make sure that I haven't written down anything you haven't said. And as he was going through, when he got to those couple of points about Tom saying that, he'd had phone calls from her, that Jean had come back, dropped off her jewellery, which was the only thing of value that she left. She left everything else, all the possessions at the house. The only thing she took with her, allegedly, was the jewellery on her fingers. And apparently some months later, she's snuck back into the house without being caught by Tom, put the jewellery on the table, and then left again. And like when Tom was telling us, I'm thinking, why would someone who is leaving what we believe is a violent relationship and had nothing but the clothes she was wearing, didn't take her prized possessions, her dolls and things, why would you take the chance of coming back and leaving rings?
Yeah, it just doesn't add up.
Didn't make sense. But then when this prison informant's telling us his information, I thought, well, he must have spoken to Keir. And then he told us where to find Jean's body, under the house, between brick piers.
Right. So with that type of information, what did you do with it from there?
Well, as it turned out, that later that morning, I had to pick the detective sergeant up, the boss up from the airport. He flew back in to Sydney from being out in the country doing interviews. So I picked him up and on the way back to Mount Druitt Police Station, told him what had just happened. He said, what are your thoughts? And I said, well, I believe him for these reasons. And he said, good, as soon as we get back, ring up and get a search warrant to search the property. So that's what we did.
Yeah. And did you find anything straight away?
No, not on the first search.
And to search the property for bones, it's not a little operation, is it?
No.
You don't just walk out there with a torch and look, there's a fair bit to do. So
no, that's right. See,
and you got a search warrant for it? You had made application for the search warrant?
That's right.
Yep.
And to backtrack a little bit, we'd already had a search warrant initially when he was charged with Rosalina's murder.
Yeah.
And various neighbours said Tom used to bury things in the backyard. They'd seen him bury car engine, fence panels, gates, lumps of concrete. And one of the neighbours said, and he's also buried a 44-gallon drum.
Right.
He'd just dig a hole and put it in the ground and cover it over, which, again, was sort of strange behaviour.
Yeah.
But my interest was tweaked at the 44-gallon drum. I thought, okay, that may be where the body is. So we'd got a search warrant early in the piece, got an excavator in. We dug right around the yard, all around. We just hadn't gone under the house. We found everything, car engine, panels, gates, lumps of concrete, found everything but the drum. Mm-hmm. It wasn't there.
Okay, and that was a continuation from the murder scene of the second wife.
That's right.
And the search was done there.
Yes.
But then you've got this additional information as the investigation rolls on from the informants that it was under the house, buried under the house.
That's right.
So you got a further search warrant or a coroner's order or whatever to go in and search that.
That's correct, to search under the house.
Yep.
And the other interesting thing, this prison informant is from the eastern suburbs. He doesn't know the blocks and the houses out. He'd never been out in the western suburbs, he said. So it was interesting that he said she was buried under the house between brick piers.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how the house was set up. It was elevated especially on the western side, on brick piers. It wasn't a slab on the ground.
Yeah.
So just little things like that added up. And so we got the second search warrant, went there, and eventually found a bone. One of the uniformed guys digging on the western edge of the house alongside a brick pier, found a bone. Mm. Handed it to one of the detectives on site. He came and showed me and said, just found this. He said, it looks a bit like a chicken bone. And I said, well, I don't know a chicken bone from a human bone.
Yeah.
We'll bag it, take it back and get it examined. And we continued on. The very next morning, I was called into the superintendent's office. I was actually supposed to be on a day off. Got called in because of the work that was going on. He was a bit worried about damage being caused. And whilst talking to the superintendent at Mount Druitt, one of the young detectives ran down the hallway, said, sorry to interrupt. He said, Pete, information from the forensic pathologist is that bone that was found yesterday is a human finger.
Mm. Okay,
So,
well, that's exciting. And you've been a little bit kind there, because I read in your book that there was a level between the superintendent and yourself. There was someone else that was giving it to you about why you're wasting time doing this, and which I only raise because it's classic detective story. You've got to fight with some boss at some stage. You can't solve a crime without the fights. And it's not being critical of the bosses. And we were talking about this the other day. They got competing interests and all that.
Yes.
And it's an argy-bargy type of business, investigating crimes. And when you're passionately following something, and the boss is looking at it going, no, I don't think we can expend that, or there's other cases I want you to work on, and this and that. So the timing of when the bloke came in and said it's confirmed as a human bone, that was sort of a stuff you moment.
It was, really.
Yeah.
It was.
And that was right in the meeting where you're getting grilled by the boss of why you're wasting time and effort. And
and potentially causing damage that it's going to come back and bite us, and that. And as I said, I got called in to bring my notebook in, show the superintendent the interview I had with the prison informant as to why we got the search warrant. And I must say, it wasn't the actual head of the detective's office. It was someone filling in for him that was questioning what we were doing.
And we don't have to name names, but I make the point that with homicide investigations, invariably you get one or two chances to solve them. And if you miss those chances, they can remain unsolved. Now, the fact that you pushed and pushed, what if you just said, yeah, okay, I'll stop searching, and that you hadn't found that bone at this stage? We wouldn't be sitting here talking.
No.
The case wouldn't be solved.
No, that's correct.
And these are the things that sometimes you've got to push. It's not an easy gig, solving difficult homicides, and you've got to push. So anyway, I just get excited talking where someone's pushed that little bit further and got the breakthrough. So what was going through your mind? How did you feel when it was confirmed as a part of a human skeleton?
It was euphoric, really. It's all of a sudden you can see that the hard work you're putting in and what you believed in was now coming to fruition, that we were on the right track. And we were confident then of being in a position to solve this matter and give some answers to the family, because they knew what was going on. They knew we were investigating it as a possible homicide. So the first thing I did was ring the coroner and let the coroner know what we'd found, and update him. He then directed that the forensic pathologists come out and supervise the continuation of the digging. So they did. They spent the next few days, and we ultimately, at that location, found the 7 bones as referred to in the book.
Okay. And when we're talking about bones, like people might assume it's a thigh bone or one of the larger ones, but we're talking digital fingers.
Fingers, the left patella kneecap, which is a round bone at the front of your knee, a toe bone. So we're talking about small bones. We're not talking about large bones.
And were they found in a specific area, like a narrow area, or was it spread out over the yard? Like I'm trying to, if you're finding bits and pieces, where's the rest of the body? Yeah,
no, they were found in one location, alongside one of the external brick piers on the edge of the house. And they were all in that one location. So when the first bone was found, we identified the area and then continued digging at that location. We did have rescue squad personnel go right through the house. Any area where they believed the dirt seemed a little bit different, we would dig up there. But it was a very difficult scene, because as you moved to the eastern edge of the house, the slope of the ground meant that you virtually had no room at that side. At the western edge, you had about 3 feet, perhaps, a gap between ground level and floor level.
And I think some of those places, I think it's got to be 12 inches off the ground or even less. It can get very, it's a difficult area to search. And the other thing is, this doesn't solve a murder just because you found the bones. First of all, the bones haven't been identified.
That's correct.
So they could be anyone's
That's correct.
bones. And I just want to keep it, because it is such a fascinating story, I just want to keep it in context with what's happening with the other matter with that he was charged with his Rosalina.
Yes.
He got bail. Had he been to trial at this stage, or is he still waiting trial when those bones were found?
No, he was still waiting trial.
Okay, so you've got a bloke waiting for trial for the murder of his second wife, and you've started to reinvestigate the disappearance of his first wife, and you've found bones, and that search was conducted on the basis of you got information from a prison informant.
That's correct.
What did you have to do to identify the bones?
Okay, we took them to the forensic laboratories in Sydney for DNA testing. But back in the early 90s, DNA testing in Australia was in its infancy. We weren't really specialised in DNA extraction. So I ended up getting told to take them down to Melbourne, to the forensic labs there, that they were more advanced than our Sydney labs. So they went down there. I took them down, and the forensic pathologist down there told me they got a result on the first hit, but couldn't duplicate the results.
Yeah.
So he said, "Look, it's not good enough."
And the result, as in identifying it as genes,
Yes.
DNA.
Yes.
So you would have had to get samples from the parents.
Yes, and that's another strange twist to this whole investigation, because we always believed Jean's biological parents were Christine and her husband Clifford.
Yep.
Because we had to get blood from the biological parents to do the DNA sampling, when I spoke to Christine, she said, Clifford's not Jean's father.
Right, okay.
I fell pregnant to another man with Jean, and she told Cliff.
Okay, so at least he was aware of it.
He was aware of it. Yeah. He married Christine and took Jean on as his own little girl. And for all intents and purposes, he was Jean's dad.
Yeah.
And she looked up to him as her father. I'm not sure whether Jean ever found out that Clifford wasn't her biological dad. But straight away when Christine told me that, I thought, okay.
Now we've got to find
Now we've got a big problem. Yeah. How on earth are we going to find someone from 20 years ago?
Yeah.
But fortunately, Christine knew, she gave us his name and knew where he lived.
Right.
So we tracked him down. He confirmed the information and agreed to provide a sample of blood.
Right.
So we got lucky.
Okay. So taking back to the Melbourne studio, it's, or the Melbourne laboratory, they've identified first sample saying, yes, it looks like it's genes, but they couldn't replicate it.
They couldn't replicate it.
Because back in those days, they could only take small samples, couldn't they, sometimes? And there's only so many tests they could do on it.
That's correct. And the forensic pathologist there said to me, if you want to get definitive proof and get the best DNA evidence, you need to take the bones to America, the Department of Defence. They're the leading technicians in this field. So I brought that information back. I think there was also DNA tests tried to be done in South Australia, but they got no result there either.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until some years later when Jan Stevenson became the coroner at Westmead, and she had a particular interest in unsolved murders, and I was the prosecutor there with her at the time, and I said, well,
it's funny how things line up, isn't it? That it's if these paths, if you weren't working at the coroner's court, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here talking. There's all different things that come into play with homicide investigations. Look, I think at this stage we're going to take a break. You can tell by the tone of my voice I'm excited because I like to hear stories how they play out, and I think it's fascinating how this one plays out. Let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll continue on about what happened with the bones and all the circumstances that came into play before anyone was convicted of these crimes, or a crime. So,
okay,
back soon.